Hello, friends and listeners. Today's episode is one that I'm really pumped about. It is with Dr. Andrew Weil, who has been called the medical Nostradamus for his foresight into what's on the healthcare horizon. He is on to trends or insights often decades before they're mainstream, and we actually catalog all of the things he's been ahead of the curve on in this episode. It's really fascinating, the track record he's had, and it's no wonder he's a world-renowned pioneer in the medical and healthcare space. His resume could take up a 20-minute intro, and I'm not going to do that. But he is the best-selling author of over a dozen books, and I think it's 15 at last count. Founder and director of the Arizona Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona, the co-founder of one of my favorite restaurants and my wife's all-time favorite restaurant, True Food Kitchen, which has 20-something, maybe 30 locations now around the country. He's also a massive matcha tea fan. More on that in a bit. He was one of the earliest healthcare professionals to openly write about diet and nutrition, openly criticizing the healthcare system for the overprescription of pharmaceuticals. He's popularized themes like healthy aging, the mind-body connection, breathing techniques, all years and sometimes decades before the rest of the medical community started to take note of these various trends and insights. I asked him after the episode something I wish I'd asked him on air, and he gave me permission to mention it here. And that was, I asked him about his dietary and healthcare advice for founders, leaders, creators, employees in high-stress jobs or in high-stress situations in life. His response was that his first, second, third, fourth, fifth piece of advice would be to watch his short video on YouTube on the 4-7-8 breathing technique. It's about a 5-minute video. It's free. You can watch it on YouTube for free. And the technique in which you implement a specific type of breathing technique is also free. Breathing is one of the only activities that is both voluntary and involuntary. And Dr. Weil explained this to me, that basically said you involuntarily breathe and you can voluntarily shift your breathing. And therefore, it's one of the only activities we can do to communicate back to the involuntary parts of our physiology that can get out of whack easily when stressed. Things like spikes of cortisol or increased heart rate. And these things can be remedied by something as simple as practicing the super short breathing technique that he talks about on that video. I put the link to the video in the show notes so you can check it out there. So I'm not going to do an ad for this week's episode. I'd rather encourage people to go check out that video instead. It's that powerful, and I think would just do the audience way more good than an advertisement this week. So I'm going to take out the ad just to try to push people and encourage people to go check out that video on YouTube. If you dig below the line, we'd love a review. It takes about 5 seconds. You don't even have to write anything anymore. You can just put down the stars. It's how podcast platforms rank and suggest podcasts. So every single review matters. And if you're one of the folks that have already given us a review, especially all the 5-star reviews we've gotten, know that we appreciate and read every single one. Thank you so much. So without further ado, let's get into it with Dr. Andrew Weil. This is Below the Line. All right, we are here with Dr. Andrew Weil.
Hi, James.
Thank you for hosting me. To set the setting here, we are in Tucson, Arizona, in your lovely home, and it is beautiful, warm outside. We are certainly in the heart of the desert.
Yeah.
But it's beautiful. Maybe it's because it's the desert, but I just know that I notice I'm not a botanist by any means, but I'm just noticing the flora so much more, maybe
this is
because
a very
of the contrast.
Desert. This is the upper Sonora desert. There's 4 deserts in North America, and this is by far the lushest. We have 2 rainy seasons, so very diverse and abundant flora and fauna.
Well, it is, as the drive here, I couldn't stop looking at all of the green and the contrast of just the all of the brown, all of the desert.
Yeah.
It's really a really cool contrast. I want to chat about Tucson and what brought you here, but I first want to touch on what we're drinking right now, which is this episode. As listeners know, I've got a different kind of quirky drink each episode. In this episode, It's one of my absolute favorite drinks.
Me too.
It's matcha.
Yes.
And we're drinking matcha kari drink, which you're a co-owner of, co-founder of.
Yes, as co-founder, and the URL is matcha.com, and it was a great coup to get that.
Excellent URL. Yeah. Matcha.com for those listening. And I also know Andre, your co-founder.
Right.
At least we've emailed back and forth and over our love of matcha. And
so my reason for founding this company was to bring high quality matcha to people in North America, because I discovered matcha many years ago and love it, and never thought I would see it become as popular as it is now. But I've been very disappointed to see that the quality of most matcha that's out there is bad. Matcha is so finely powdered that it has such a huge surface area that it oxidizes very quickly. And if it's not stored properly, kept away from light and oxygen, it oxidizes, loses its bright green color, loses its good flavor, becomes bitter. And many people have only tasted matcha like that and really have no idea what the good stuff is like. So that was my mission.
Well, and you started, your fascination or your preference for matcha started how long ago? Just on the personal level.
Let me see, when was it? In 1959, when I was 17, I had the chance to go to Japan, and I lived with Japanese families outside of Tokyo and in Kobe. And I arrived, it was the 1st of November, gray, rainy, and Japan in those days was very different from what it is today. It was not prosperous. It was still recovering from the war. And I lived with a middle-class family in a traditional house. There was no common language. There was supposed to be a son who spoke English, but he didn't. But the day after I got there, my host mother let me know that she wanted to take me next door to meet her neighbor who practiced tea ceremony. I heard a little bit about tea ceremony, but really didn't know anything about it.
For listeners, do you mind giving a little bit of background of tea ceremony in Japan?
Well, this is something that really arose out of the Zen tradition and samurai tradition in Japan. And it was a formal way of enjoying tea and sharing time and space with people. In recent times, it became something that mostly women performed and were trained to perform. And it can get very fancy in its ritual. At that time in Japan, matcha was probably mostly associated with tea ceremony. Since then, it has escaped the tea ceremony and become an ordinary beverage that most people use. So at any rate, in the tea ceremony, there's a very formal way of boiling water, preparing the bowl, handling the utensils. So the woman who was doing this, my host mother and I sat facing her at a low table on the floor. And she, first of all, produced this bamboo whisk, which I was just fascinated by. It's a marvel of Japanese craftsmanship that's carved from one piece of bamboo.
Right.
There's something about the shape of that. I was just fascinated by that. And then the matcha powder, I had never seen anything so brilliantly green. And when she whisked it up, the color of the beverage and the way it tasted, it just captivated me. So I was determined to be able to enjoy that again. And I brought some back with me when I came back from Japan. And then when I made a number of trips to Japan in the 1970s. And whenever I'd go, I'd pick up some matcha at the airport and bring it back. And nobody here had ever heard of it or seen it.
Would you just call it green tea when you brought it back?
No, I called it matcha. And I turned a lot of friends onto it and showed them how to use it. Most people really liked it, but it's a strange thing for Americans, the whole process of whisking it. And
that is what makes it so captivating when you see a tea ceremony.
Yeah.
I've done one tea ceremony in Japan, and from the bamboo whisk, and by the way, for listeners, many listeners know that I love matcha. I've talked about it numerous times on the podcast. And I have a whole, this book coming out, Beyond Coffee, which goes into a little bit of detail on matcha as an alternative to coffee. But you were working beyond coffee 5 decades ago.
long ago.
Yeah.
And as you know, the quality of stimulation from matcha is very different from that.
Very different.
Coffee. And some of it has a lower amount of caffeine, but it also has substantial amount of L-theanine that has a calming effect, and that modifies the effect of the caffeine. So many people find they get a alert relaxation from it.
It's my preferred morning drink because of that alertness, but I'm relaxed. I'm not alert and excitable, which is the enemy of productivity.
Yes, exactly.
With one too many cups of coffee, you're not going to be very productive. No, I love it for that, and it is. I remember reading one time that because it's the whole leaf. It's like 130 times more antioxidants than regular green tea, as well as other kind of catechins and just different.
And the way matcha, the way it's produced,
the
tea plants that are destined to become matcha are grown under heavy shade for 3 weeks before harvesting. I think it's a 90% shade cloth. So in response to that, the plants produce leaves that are larger, thinner, and have more chlorophyll to take advantage of what light is there. And they also produce more of the flavor compounds and L-theanine. So that's one reason why matcha has a higher antioxidant and content and other good things in it than other tea.
Well, I think metaphorically, I want to touch back on that concept with your productivity and proliferation as a doctor, founder, advocate. It makes me interested in what your, I don't know, pre-college or pre-Harvard medical school years were like to create Dr. Andrew Weil. But before we jump into that, I also wanted to just say that I really do, and I get no kickback for this whatsoever, but Matcha matcha is phenomenal.
It's really, really
good.
Really good. And by the way, there's a discount code for people listening to the podcast. That's JB15.
All right.
So if you use that when you order, you get some off.
Well, it is. I've got it stocked in. I keep it in my freezer.
That's what I do.
Okay. I probably have it once or twice a day. But one of the things that you touched on is, the matcha that you get here in the US, I will try to introduce people to matcha. They'll get it at Starbucks, and I try to tell them, no, that's like the Folgers of
it's terrible.
Of matcha. That's not
yellow green,
right.
Often bitter. People say it tastes like seaweed or grass. I mean, good matcha is just delicious, complex flavor, a hint of bitterness, but also sweet. It's just wonderful.
Well, we have founders of amazing companies on the podcast, and I rarely spend this much time on their companies but it really is because Matcha is so
great. Thanks.
So dang good. But I want to get into your story a little bit. But before we do, I was thinking leading up to this interview, just trying to catalog in my own mind all of the different medical or health narratives that you have been on the forefront of and or the misconceptions that you were in the forefront of maybe for 2-3 decades, while people still thought maybe you were like loony, and continue to be proven right. Instead of me cataloging them in your 40 plus years of practice, I
give you a few. I mean, I have a knack for being able to see several years ahead of where evidence is going to go. I was warning people about the dangers of using antibiotics too much back in the 1970s, and that the problem of antibiotic resistance was going to grow and grow unless we got really smart about how to use them, which we didn't. I was warning people about margarine and other sources of trans fats probably 10 years before the medical community realized how dangerous they were. I mean, those are some examples, but I could give you a whole list. I was
psychedelics, at least on the forefront of cannabis not being that. Being and not to put words in your mouth, but not nearly as chaotic for society as alcohol.
Correct. And, I was experimenting with and learning about psychedelics again back in the 1960s, and I wrote a lot about their therapeutic potential in my first book, The Natural Mind, that was published in 1972. So it's amusing to me suddenly to see, all this explosion of interest in it. And, I was there a long time ago.
And then maybe one of the biggest just being integrative medicine as a whole, and integrating just medicine and techniques from different cultures for this very entrepreneurial audience. Do you mind giving a broad overview of integrative medicine?
Sure. I mean, the short definition is it's the intelligent combination of conventional medicine and natural therapies and lifestyle change, as well as using, whatever therapy works as long as it's not going to cause harm. I mean, a longer answer is that it's a system that focuses first on the innate healing potential of the human organism. And that's a concept that I think is really missing from modern medicine. That both doctors and patients really do not have a lot of confidence in the human organism's ability to maintain itself, heal itself, which to me is phenomenal. So one of my missions is to, make people more confident about that. Can I say one other thing?
Yeah,
another very important plank of integrative medicine is whole person medicine. That is, we regard human beings as more than physical bodies. Conventional medicine really restricts its view to the physical. But human beings are also mental, emotional beings, spiritual entities, community members, and those other dimensions of human life have to be taken into account to understand health and illness.
One of the things that you really recently blew my mind with last night over dinner, you were telling me about. Well, I'll let you tell in the right way, but it was around our experimentation, and in every single experiment, just about every experiment, you can go into the placebo-controlled side of the experiment. Do you mind giving?
What I said is, that this is always held up as the gold standard of scientific research. You have to do randomized, controlled, double-blind studies, especially of drugs. And an assignment that I often give medical students and doctors is to go to a library, pull out any medical journal at random that reports results of those tests, look up an article, and then flip to the end where there's a table that summarizes the results. And always, and I emphasize always, in the placebo group, there will be one or two or a small number of subjects who show all of the changes produced in the experimental group that got the drug. To me, that is the most important finding that's come out of 60, 70 years of doing this kind of research, that any change you can produce in the human organism with a pharmacological intervention can be exactly reproduced in some people, some of the time, purely by a mind-mediated mechanism. I mean, that's amazing, and we should be taking advantage of it.
Right, and it's. I had never thought about it that way, and it's still rattling around my mind of why we haven't taken that seriously.
The two sentences that I hear most frequently from conventionally minded physicians when they use the word placebo is, "Oh, that's just the placebo effect," and the interesting word there is "just." That the placebo effect is devalued. It's not like a real or as important as a real effect. And secondly is we have to rule out the placebo effect. We should be ruling it in. That's what you want.
Right.
It's the maximum healing response with the minimum intervention. That should be the goal of good medicine.
Maximum healing response with minimum
intervention.
Right. It is really fascinating. I don't know. What should the medical community do with that, or us as a community
I think this falls under the heading, the art of medicine, and that's a subject that we teach in integrative medicine. And it's about how you use words with patients. Patients project a lot of belief onto physicians, but most physicians are not trained in how to work with that. There's a way that you can reflect that belief back in a way that activates healing in people. One is by, when you give a treatment, to give it with total confidence. And the best way you have confidence is if you yourself have experienced that. If I can recommend to a patient something that I've used in myself and I know it works, my belief is going to transfer to their belief and increase the possibility of that, working for them.
And maybe equally as important is, I think there's been a growing level of disbelief or a projection of lack of confidence in doctors in just the last 5, 6, 10 years, especially with the opioid crisis and as the backdrop. And doctors, I imagine, are obviously not trained at how to deal with that or how to reinstill confidence.
I'll tell you that in a minute, but let me tell you one thing. Over the years, many patients that I've worked with have come back to me and said that in retrospect, the most important thing that I did for them was that I was the only doctor they saw who told them they could get better. I mean, that makes me very sad in a way. One of the practical pieces of advice I have for people is don't stay in treatment with a doctor who thinks you can't get better.
And how would you tactically find that out?
Well, if doctors will often say there's nothing we can do for you, or have nothing to offer you, or you'll just have to live with it.
My wife and I have a habit of just bearing everything on this podcast. My wife and I, we went through a miscarriage earlier this year, and then on Monday of this week heard that we're going to go back. Monday of last week. So going to go back this week, and the odds are not good. And the doctor just said it happens. And there's no advice on how to try to avoid a third miscarriage in a row.
Well, see, there's a lot of information out there, and many doctors are unaware of that, and those are the deficiencies that I and my colleagues are trying to correct in integrative medicine, and we train doctors in all the things that are left out of conventional medical education.
Well, and it was only mentioned to us by a friend that is a PA that said, OBGYNs, they're only trained in
very
birth
narrow,
and pregnancy.
Yep.
They're not trained in fertility, and that could be a generalization, and some might be. But when I looked it up afterwards, I was like, oh my God, that's like mind-numbingly obvious and pretty frustrating as a couple going through a second miscarriage, wondering what to do next.
Right.
And obviously the expert in the room is our OBGYN, just saying, and I'm not joking, the phrase was, this just happens. There's no advice or encouragement. When you said that it saddens you, it's also just saddens you to realize that it's just being with it's so simple to be with a doctor that actually wants you to get better. It saddens.
Who believes you can get better.
Who believes you can get better.
Right.
Right. Not just want it, but believe it. It's, as an angel investor, my full-time job is to encourage startups. I feel like it is one of the best. I can't imagine a better profession from my skill set to encourage creation, everywhere. And I'll hear from founders, and this is a sad reflection, not a pat on the back, that I'll get really excited about what they're building, and then encourage them around this or that. Yeah. And even if I don't invest, I can see why they're excited about it, why they're putting 80 hours a week into something, and find things to encourage, directions to encourage them in. And I've heard this verbatim maybe 3 times in the last 12 months, that I was their favorite angel investor because I was so encouraging. So and I was like, and honestly, the first observation is, oh, cool, great, I'm providing value. That's great. But the second observation is, why isn't
everybody doing that?
Encouraging. Right. You would think anyone, their profession, anyone that has a profession completely focused on entrepreneurship and dealing with founders each day would be encouraging. And yet, when I did kind of go through it in my own mind, when I was a founder of 3 different companies, I do remember about 98% of people just had doubt, skepticism, lack of response whatsoever. Even full-time investors, they're just constantly thinking how it wouldn't work, or maybe scarred from their excitability earlier in their careers. But I imagine that's 10 times more palpable with a doctor.
Definitely. I think a problem when I try to understand where does that pessimism come from, some of it is that they're training, and when doctors are trained in hospitals, they're seeing a very skewed sample of the sick population. They see the very sick. And in that population, healing is less likely. It still happens. But if you look at the whole spectrum of illness, the rule is that people get better. Most diseases end by themselves, and they end because the body's internal healing mechanisms take care of things. Also, I think another issue, subtle, is that doctors like to be in control. And I think it is easier for them to predict negative outcomes, because then if the patient doesn't get better, they've predicted that.
Right, they've been
and if the patient does get better, they can be pleasantly surprised. But in any way, they feel more in control. Anyway, it's very unfortunate.
I can't tell you how similar that is to startup investing. It's unless you invested in that deal, every investor is negative on it. And it is so much easier to predict a negative consequence or a negative conclusion. Okay, one of the questions that I ask just about every guest, and sometimes it's later in the podcast, but I'm really intrigued to ask this one right up front, is tell me 3 stories that have helped shape who you've become in your life.
Okay, one was, and I've told you about this, that I, by chance, won a scholarship to this experimental school when I graduated high school. It was called the International School of America. And it took a group of 22 students and 6 faculty members around the world for an academic year. And we lived with native families in each country. And that totally changed my life. First of all, it completely broke my ties with home.
And you're in Philly?
Yeah, Philly. My mother said after that, I never really came home. But also, it really opened my eyes to how different cultures interpret reality differently. That we don't have a monopoly on how things are. And that when you're in other cultures, you see that people have different experiences. They interpret experiences in different ways. That has enormously influenced my thinking about food, about medicine, about all sorts of things. And travel has been a huge part of my life ever since.
What are some of the specific examples that you recall from that experience that just kind of blew you away and restructured your thinking?
Well, I'll tell you one picture that stands out of my mind. I was in Calcutta on night of the full moon, and
what year was this again?
1959. Okay. And another student in this group, a woman, and I had wandered down to the banks of the river, and there was a Hindu temple there, and we ran into some sadhu, a holy man, who talked to us about being the sound of the universe. And then he chanted that and I'd never heard that before. And it was like I felt it throughout my body. I mean, it was an amazing experience. I mean, that's just one example.
I imagine that must have been so foreign from Philly in the 50s
Yep.
to Calcutta and hearing and I think maybe, living in San Francisco, you're introduced to the sound Om.
I'll give you one other example. In Japan, I never liked breakfast growing up. I didn't like the things that I was given to eat. I hated milk. I didn't like eggs. I didn't like cereal.
Taste-wise?
It's just not what I wanted. And I never knew what I wanted. And then I arrived in Japan, and in this family was served a traditional Japanese breakfast, which was some steamed rice, piece of broiled fish, miso soup, green tea, some pickled vegetables, some steamed vegetables. That was just what I wanted. I mean, it was just what it tasted great. I felt great afterward. I mean, I loved it. And then I didn't go back to Japan for about 15 years. And I was very surprised when I went back to see how few Japanese were eating Japanese breakfast anymore. Most of them were drinking coffee, eating scrambled eggs and toast and butter. And, a huge change. And you can only get Japanese breakfast in hotels. I mean, maybe that's, going back some now. But that's an example, again, of a cultural difference that really influenced me.
Was that one of your first experiences with diet affecting kind of a functional diet affecting?
Yeah, I mean, I felt good.
That day?
Whereas when I ate most, American breakfast foods, I didn't feel good, especially if I ate something like, pancakes, which is horrible. I felt dull and sluggish all day.
It probably only hit me in my 20s and I realized, all right, if I have 2 pancakes, I need a nap right after.
Right, exactly.
But yeah, when I was 13, that was a special treat to have.
And I also, in that year, 1959, ate sashimi and sushi, which was a completely novel
way
experience.
Before America. Yeah.
And if anybody had told me when I came back that, one day cowboys in Arizona are going to be eating sushi, I would never have believed that. It was amazing to see that happen here.
What is something, I know the world has become a lot smaller in the last, that's almost 60 years.
Yeah.
That is 60 years.
A little scary.
What is, I know the world's a lot smaller today and our cultures have definitely meshed more, but what is something that you think Americans might love 20 years from now that you'd say today is still pretty foreign to them?
Well, I keep looking for things.
Well, matcha might be a great example, actually.
I keep looking for things. One is another Japanese ingredient is a starch called kuzu. It actually comes from the plant that people who are called kudzu, which is a noxious, invasive weed in the South. Mm-hmm. But in Japan, it's not invasive like that. And the starch, the root produces a very high quality starch, better than anything else. And it stabilizes blood sugar. It has many health effects, pretty much unknown here. And I've been trying to turn people onto that.
Really? Interesting. Are there any others? I feel I think you have, a gold mine
lots of them.
These things. Is there anything that you thought would take off in the last 60 years of being kind of ahead of the curve that either you yourself are like, oh, nope, this isn't it?
Well, I suppose tea is one thing, because even before I was working with matcha, I was promoting green tea in general. And at that time, this is true in a lot of places, it's very hard to get a cup of good green tea in America. Even in like a fine hotel, if you ask for green tea, often it's yellow-brown or it's got jasmine in it. To get really good sencha Japanese green tea is hard, but I was talking about the health benefits of that, again, long before it was popular here. And I think my writings and talking about that is one thing that increased interest in tea.
And your health, the health benefits on its own or in contrast to something like coffee?
I think both, because it does not have a lot of the irritating effects on the body that coffee does. It's not as addictive. And in addition, there's a great deal of epidemiological evidence about people who drink tea, having better health and longevity. Another one is, I was telling people to eat kale long ago. Yeah. And, I discovered this kale salad, and I was in Tuscany in Italy and was served this. I would never have thought of eating raw kale. And the possibility that by letting it sit for a while in lemon juice and salt,
soften it up.
It softens, it changes the color, reduces the bitterness. So when I started the True Food Kitchen restaurants, that was one of the main dishes, and that's become our signature dish. And at one point, True Food Kitchen totally bankrupted kale production, organic kale production in Southern California. We used it all up. So, just an example of how popular, I think that's really something that I pretty much popularized.
And that was really overnight. I mean, 10 years to overnight that it went from, the salad bar at Pizza Hut and it's ornamental and basically cardboard to all, all of the rage. I was at a stand-up little routine. It's not really a stand-up place, but it's atop this shout out to Pizza Hacker in San Francisco. On Tuesday nights they've got free stand-up, and there's a stand-up there from Wisconsin that was making a joke about how she couldn't keep up with all the milks that San Francisco's, she had a joke about almond milk, and then someone said afterwards, you should use oat milk in that joke to be even more just San Francisco. And she's like, I can't keep up with your milks. And to that same person, she goes, and this is a very just normal looking 27-year-old guy or something. She was like, I bet you love kale. And he just yells, fuck yeah. And my wife and I laughed about that for probably 3 or 4 days, just how enthusiastic. I mean, this guy might as well have been cheering for the Kansas City Chiefs in the way that he was cheering for kale. And kale is, I'm also part of the, the laggards that, I probably only got into really liking it a year or two ago. Now I really, really love it. And you mentioned True Foods, which I got to give a shout out there. My wife, she is a major fan. I was telling you yesterday that every time we go down to go back to Texas, where we have one in Dallas. I don't think there's one in San Francisco.
Dallas, actually, you have one in the northern suburb.
Oh, awesome.
Plano, I think.
Yeah, and we don't have any in San Francisco.
No, the real estate's too expensive there. There's one in Walnut Creek and one in Palo Alto.
Okay, well, when we're in Dallas,
circling around.
Yes, yeah. Well, it's when we're in Dallas, she goes 3 times a week, and it really is. It's her favorite restaurant. I really enjoy peddling your things because it's really it's not even for you, it's for listeners, because I know that it's a really healthy choice for them. Yeah, and True Foods is really good tasting food, but obviously much healthier than a lot of alternatives. Our previous favorite restaurant in San Francisco or in Dallas was just a Tex-Mex restaurant. I don't even want to know.
Yeah, I won't ask
how good or bad that was for us. With True Foods, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, and this I think ties into a through line with this conversation for the audience of entrepreneurs, startup, creatively minded people, is the anti-inflammatory diet that I think, if I got it right, started as a diet way before True Foods as a restaurant.
I was onto that long ago. In fact, I think this is another example of, I was one of the first people to talk about chronic low-level inflammation being the root cause of really serious chronic diseases. And I developed an anti-inflammatory diet as the best overall health strategy. I based it on the Mediterranean diet because...
What year about was this? That
I would say this was in probably 1990s, and I began writing about that. And as I said, we have tremendous evidence for the health benefits of a Mediterranean diet, and people like that. So I tweaked that by adding Asian influences to it based on my experiences in Japan and China and other parts of Asia. I added turmeric and ginger and Asian mushrooms and green tea and so forth, and developed this eating plan. So that was long before the idea of True Food Kitchen.
I feel like it is inflammation. It's another thing just in the last 2-3 years. You've been I want to try to stump you on things that you've been wrong on, but you really, that's another thing that's worth just pursuing a little bit more for listeners. Inflammation and they're seeing its effects on depression, or it's it being a major cause for certain types of depression, mental illness, anxiety, irritable bowel syndrome, which is basically, who knows what IBS actually is, but it's a catch-all for many things. And many of them could be, it's kind of like mental illness. It's a catch-all for so many things. But tell me a little bit more about how you even just started to come across, like, let's take that one for example. How do you start to piece this together? Hey, there could be something here when no one else is piecing this together.
I'll tell you a story. When I was in both college and medical school, I hated libraries. I wanted to get out of them as fast as possible. So I developed a skill.
You went through a lot of school for someone that was reading hate libraries.
But I developed a skill of being able to find exactly the information I wanted in the least amount of time. And often I could scan through titles of things and, this is one I want to pay attention to. But even when I got it, I would just read a little bit of the abstract. I got it. So I've always had that talent. I've been able to scan widely and see things that.
Did you know that was a talent early on, or did you feel like there was a deficiency?
I didn't know. No, I knew. No, well, no, I knew it was a talent because I watched other people like struggling and being in terrible moods, with stuff. And I just had the ability to do that. Now, also, since I started the Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona, I have a tremendous number of former students and graduates out there who are always sending me things. So I just, anything of interest passes my desk, and I quickly know whether it's something that I should pay attention to or not.
What are some signs of something recently or something related to anti-inflammation?
Let's see. I'll just mention a couple things. One, there was an interesting article that I glanced at a couple weeks ago, looking at the microbiome of organically raised food versus conventional food. Plants have microbiomes. So this study looked at apples and the microbiome of apples, not just on the skin, but in the flesh and in the seeds. And the microbiome of organic apples was very different from that of conventionally raised, different organisms. And that's a very interesting fact. And it's possible that those different organisms are much better for your gut than what you get in conventional produce. I just saw another one that caught my attention. I mentioned this to you, is that the vagus nerve seems to transmit serotonin that's manufactured in the gut. There's a great production of serotonin in the gut. And the vagus nerve seems to carry this to the brain. And this may be a link, between the gut and mental, emotional states, really interesting.
Right. And I know that there's, I know I'm like a pop medicine person. So it's, I do really love reading this research. The research is that once you start to, it's almost like collecting baseball cards. Right. Once you start to have kind of a collection of different ideas and areas that you're interested in, you could be insurance sales in Kansas City and still start to piece these things together and find it really fascinating. Right. I know I have, and that that went into the book that's coming out later this year around nootropics and adaptogens and mushrooms. That's really cognitive performance or productivity has been my field of interest. So I can totally identify with just reading them briefly or just accumulating a handful of them in a topic that you're interested in, then it does become easier to start to see where these piece together. But I bring that up because, in the vagus nerve, I remember hearing that in serotonin, is it coming from your stomach?
Yes, it's manufactured in the intestines.
And there's a third of your neurons or something are in your stomach, GI tract.
The second brain.
Right. And we conventionally just say the squiggly organ in your head, that's your mind, that's your brain, that's where everything important is happening.
Yeah.
And
no interaction with the body.
Right.
Now, even though the evidence is right in front of our face, I'll give you one thing anyone can observe. If you were on a college campus at exam time, you look at the numbers of students who come into student health services with GI upsets, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting. I mean, it's obvious. That's like, right in front of your eyes, and people don't see it.
I know in many startups and many founder friends develop GI issues. And I remember hearing on a previous podcast guest, he described or defined a toxic workplace, not toxic in terms of the PC level, but a toxic workplace for your own productivity is when you have high expectations and low control. And it's that contrast. One of those is fine without the other.
Yeah.
But when you combine the two, it leads to extreme lack of productivity, distraction, and ultimately a lot of stress. That articulation just stuck with me. And I think it's certainly, when I had developed kind of stomach issues, I feel like it's always, now when I look back, it was always in the mix of high expectation, low control. And it doesn't surprise me that students, I'm sure I had that to really some degree of high expectations, low control. And that is the startup environment in so many ways. It's just that. In fact, I feel like many startups try to bridge the gap of high expectations, low control by raising the expectations even more. And I think that's inspiring on day one, but it can be in Nir's words, quite toxic day 181. But with anti-inflammation, what do you remember back in the 90s, what you were kind of piecing together?
Well, I was seeing articles in various places that were looking at inflammatory causes, contributors to chronic conditions that I'd never thought of. And I began to see a pattern there, that this was a common theme. And diseases that when I was in medical school, I was taught had nothing to do with each other, like cancer and heart disease and Alzheimer's disease. These were completely independent disease entities. Turn out that they may be linked. They may have a common root in uncontrolled inflammation. And if that's the case, then there's things you can do to reduce that risk because, there are factors that influence inflammation that are under our control.
And do you mind going into a little bit more detail for listeners of what you mean by inflammation?
Everyone knows inflammation on the surface of the body. It's local redness, heat, swelling, and pain at an area that's injured or under attack. And inflammation is actually, although it can be uncomfortable, is the cornerstone of the body's healing response. It's how the body gets more nourishment and more immune activity to an area that needs it.
More oxygen, more
food, more immune, more defensive action. But inflammation is so powerful and it's so potentially destructive that it's really important that it stays where it's supposed to stay and end when it's supposed to end. So the body has evolved very elaborate mechanisms to control how much inflammation you produce and to cool it off when it's not needed. If you can't produce enough inflammation, you're vulnerable to infection. If you produce too much inflammation, you get allergies, autoimmunity, but then over long term, you have greatly increased risks of these serious chronic diseases. I think the important thing to understand is that inflammation is important. It has its place, but it has to be in balance. And there's a lot of factors that influence that. There's genetic factors, but there's things under your control. Stress influences inflammation. Exposure to toxins in the environment. Secondhand tobacco smoke is a powerful pro-inflammatory agent. And diet has a huge role. And the mainstream North American diet is strongly pro-inflammatory. It gives us the wrong fats, the wrong kinds of carbs, and not enough of the protective elements that are mostly in fruits, vegetables, herbs, spices, beverages.
Do we know how the mechanism works if you eat, let's say, what would be a great example of a pro-inflammatory?
Like you look at fats. We know that trans fats, partially hydrogenated oils, unsaturated oils, if they oxidize, they all promote inflammation. Whereas, omega-3 fatty acids have a strong anti-inflammatory effect. So that's something you can change in your diet. You eliminate the pro-inflammatory fats and you try to eat more of the anti-inflammatory fats.
When I look back at my health choices and diet choices, but also exercise and mental health choices, when I was young, it's so easy to build these bad habits because, you can have the pro-inflammatory response. I imagine it's maybe because you have the pro-inflammatory response that's natural with that food, but you have the anti-inflammatory response that can coincide with it. But as we get older, that second part maybe isn't up to the challenge as much as when we were 16 or 23.
I think it's really important to get basic information about health and lifestyle to kids, starting in kindergarten. And it's not complicated. You can explain the basic facts about nutrition and everything else in the healing system of the body in ways people can understand. For example, I'll give you one thing I would do.
More examples, the better. Okay. I love examples.
Most people don't know that all of your bone mass and muscle mass are built up very early in life, usually up to the late 20s. After that, you can't add any more muscle mass or bone mass. It's all downhill from there. And all you can do is slow loss. So if people understood that would, I hope, motivate them in those years, teenage years and early 20s, to have the habits that are going to increase bone and muscle mass, because that's going to last you for the rest of your life, and not undermine them. Like not smoking and not drinking sugary drinks and, doing the right kinds of exercise and all that.
Right. Not eating pizza.
I love pizza. It's got to be good pizza.
Well, I think everything in moderation. I used to eat pizza all the time, and I used to just think, I'm lucky with a fast metabolism.
Yeah, right.
And but not knowing that there's a whole lot more going on. Than just.
And you get away with a lot of stuff when you're young, so you don't see the immediate effects. But the fact is that the habits you build up at that time have very long range consequences.
Why hasn't the anti-inflammatory diet become as just in vogue as kind of keto and gluten-free?
Well, first of all, it's not a diet; it's a way of eating. And I think it is gaining a lot of currency out there, especially among knowledgeable people. It's not faddish. It's also not extreme, and people really seem to like extreme things. I don't think it's healthy to throw a whole macronutrient under the bus. It is not good to eliminate carbohydrate or to eliminate fat. I think people need to understand that there are good fats and bad fats. There are good carbs and less good carbs, and you want to make the right choices. There's a term that's been proposed recently called Orthorexia Nervosa. It has not yet been officially accepted as an eating disorder, but it's an obsession with, healthy eating and right eating and leaving out whole categories of food. And eating disorder specialists saying that they're seeing more and more people with it. In my own experience, I find it more and more frustrating to cook dinner for groups of people. This person doesn't eat gluten. This one doesn't eat dairy. There was a wonderful cartoon in the New Yorker a few years ago by Ries. It was called The Last Thanksgiving, parody of the first Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims Indians. And in this, there are 12 people sitting around an empty table looking very unhappy, and they have balloons over their head. And one is, doesn't drink milk, doesn't eat dairy, can't tolerate gluten, allergic to wheat. There's nothing to eat.
My wife is probably nodding her head because I've gone vegetarian, I've gone gluten-free.
It's good to experiment. I'm all for experimenting, but I was in Okinawa earlier this year. I've been there a number of times to look at healthy longevity there. I love Okinawa. It's an amazing place, very different from the rest of Japan. But this time I sat around with a group of centenarians and who all were great and happy. And the one piece they were asked, what is your secret? And everyone, the first words that they said were eat everything. Now, I don't think they meant eat McDonald's, because that has become increasingly popular in Okinawa and is sabotaging Okinawan longevity. But, I think this idea of, not restricting your dietary choices extremely, to me, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I can certainly see some connection with almost of an addictive type to go on these hardcore diets and then talk about it ad nauseum with people. And it, it's pat on the back. I saw another
cartoon that I love. This was in Spanish. A Mexican friend sent it to me. It was a couple sitting in a restaurant, and there's a waitress there, and they're saying to the waitress, we don't eat gluten, we don't eat wheat, we don't eat meat, we don't blah, blah. What should we order? And she says a taxi.
That is, I can sympathize with that as a host as well.
Right.
For people, friends that I know listen to this podcast probably know or might be putting themselves in that bucket, but I belong in there too. I've certainly kept people guessing on what I was trying out at a certain point in time. On the just to kind of put a capstone on the anti-inflammatory diet, what is some of the research? And you touched on a low grade inflammation causing certain issues. What are some of the specific issues that you've seen? I know that I, as a very interested party around mental health, has definitely seen it.
Well, that's a huge change in thinking. The idea that there's an inflammatory component of depression, and that some forms of major depression respond to treatment with anti-inflammatory drugs. I mean, that's amazing. That's a completely new way of thinking just in the past few years.
I had a friend in college that would say that he always felt great when he took Advil. And I knew that he suffered from depression. He had confided in me that he did completely separately. 6, 7, 8 months later, he was joking that he's like painkillers.
Amazing.
And saying, and then he followed up by saying, I actually feel really good.
So I don't know whether you know the story of how this idea came about. It's pretty interesting. I know the man, Chuck Raison, who was one of the formulators of this hypothesis. There's a phenomenon that's been very well known in domestic animals called sickness behavior. When animals get sick, they exhibit a characteristic pattern of if they stop eating, they stop moving, they don't interact,
socializing,
no sex, they stop socializing. And farmers traditionally attributed this to fatigue associated with illness. And then in the 1970s, to everybody's astonishment, it was found that sickness behavior was mediated by a blood-borne factor. That is, you could take blood from an animal with this behavior, inject it into a healthy animal, and it developed the same pattern of behavior. So they didn't know what it was for a long time. And then it was identified as a group of compounds called cytokines that mediate inflammation in the body. And actually, if you think about it, evolutionarily, this makes sense. If you're sick, you want to conserve energy. So you don't want to waste it on digestion.
Or if you twist an ankle, you want to put yourself out of harm's way, get away from people, conserve energy and heal for 2 weeks.
Right. So it may be that, the inflammatory response, affects the brain in a way that changes your behavior and affects mood. So this is like a whole new way of thinking.
And you could absolutely see it being a simple evolutionary track of conserve energy, get away from danger zones, big social settings, and just heal for 2 weeks for your twisted ankle. But if it is low-grade chronic inflammation from your diet, then, well, it's a 6-month potential cycle of depression.
Right.
It is fascinating. What is the medical world like when it starts to piece these things together? Because this is happening, as we speak, in the last 2-3 years.
Yeah.
Is it just, I have no idea, and I don't think listeners either. Is it maybe 12 advocates just now starting to talk about it amongst themselves? Is it 2,000 doctors that are like, all right, we
That's interesting to think about. The longtime dean of our College of Medicine here at the University of Arizona, who was the person that gave the green light to start this integrative medicine program, Jim Dahlin, a cardiologist, said that one thing he learned in his career was that how doctors respond to new information is more a function of its source than its content. If information comes from an unfamiliar source, that their reaction is to be defensive and reject it. And the example that he gave from his own career, interesting, is that the possibility that aspirin is a blood thinning agent that may reduce risk of heart attack was first proposed by a general practitioner in Kansas who wrote an article. He noticed when he took aspirin that his shaving cuts bled longer. And then he observed that in that day they were taking tonsils out of everyone, and it was common to give kids a product called Aspergum to chew, and that the kids who chewed that had more bleeding in their throats. So he started giving aspirin to his friends and neighbors and asking them to notice what happened, and their shaving cuts bled more. So he wrote up this article in a journal of general practice saying aspirin has blood thinning properties and it may be useful to prevent heart attacks. It took 40 years for the cardiology community to come around to that point of view because the article was written by a general practitioner, not a cardiologist, and it appeared in a journal of general practice. If that's how they react to something like that, think how they react to something coming from Chinese medicine or herbal medicine. So I don't know. It's sometimes a slow process. Look at the microbiome stuff. When I was in medical school, I was taught that people who ate, yogurt were health nuts. I was taught that there were all these organisms in the gut, and they aided with digestion, and that was it. And suddenly, it looks like this is the key to all of our interactions with the environment and a major determinant of physical and mental health. So I'd say that idea slowly percolated up as research stuff started coming out. And now everybody's, on that bandwagon.
Why do you think that is? I feel like the resistance to new information, you've been in many ways the canary in the coal mine in so many different, you have a pretty unique perspective on this, I would imagine. Why do you think there is so much resistance built up in the medical community, in the startup community? It's like you come up with something new,
they're going to go for it.
And maybe it's the commercial side of it, but there's such a hunger for what's next. In
some cases, it's the people that have commitments to the old way of thinking, are threatened. For example, when laparoscopic gallbladder surgery first came on the scene, infinite improvement over open abdominal gallbladder surgery. A lot of surgeons told patients that it was not a good idea. It was unavailable because they weren't trained in it. All they knew was to cut the abdomen open and take the gallbladder out. So that's clearly a vested interest that influenced their thinking. With a lot of the environmental stuff, this is a major thing I'm interested in. What are the dangers of cell phones? What are the dangers of this kind of pollution, that kind of pollution? There are very powerful vested interests that, try to control the information. And it's very hard to sort through that. And often the research results are contradictory. And, it's not clear what to do. My sense is that you go with the precautionary principle and, you avoid things, until you know more about them.
Seems like an artistic balance, as you noted, between the cautiousness and the potential for something new.
Right.
How have you, and I want to get back to the 3 stories right after this question, but how do you balance that, you personally, as an individual, as a thought leader within healthcare? How do you balance caution and the pursuit of potential?
Well, if you look at, say, if I hear about a new treatment, whether it's an herb or something like that, the first thing I do is to assure myself that it can't harm people. If I can be assured that it's not harmful, then I'm willing to experiment with it until we have more evidence about efficacy.
Right. I guess, yeah, the contrast to the startup world is there's not much downside if your photo sharing app
Right.
or if your 3D technology doesn't work. But with health, it's a whole new paradigm, or a completely different paradigm. But and just to touch on ibuprofen and depression, I think it's turmeric and ginger. Maybe you'd agree with me, or would be far better in terms of that downside, potential
true.
downsides.
However, the NSAIDs are powerful and useful drugs, and you just have to be aware of their dangers, which is that if they're used regularly, there's a significant risk of GI bleeding that can kill people.
Right.
But that almost everything in medicine, there's benefits versus risks, and you have to do an analysis of that.
Just out of personal curiosity, does turmeric have a similar downside?
No, I think it's got nothing, comparable to, the pharmaceuticals.
Because it is super powerful for me, and it really is a cognitive shift to say, okay, this herb that no one is talking about, turmeric, or this root that no one is talking about, will help with a headache or help with swelling from working out, and everyone just kind of just knows Advil is what you take for a headache, but it really works wonders for me. But there's almost the anti-placebo effect of the just some of this lack of confidence in something that's really cheap or free. Like your breathing technique, which has helped me in innumerable anxious situations, which we can touch on as well. But if it's free, or if it's cheap, or if it's just a
root. If it doesn't involve a drug or a device, people don't take it seriously.
And the obvious follow-up is, I wonder how to change that. Can you change that?
I think the way you change, the most powerful way to change it is through personal experience. If people themselves experience something, then they believe. Next to that is if they have a friend or family member that has experienced it, they might believe.
So my mother went on a gluten-free diet and said that that's why I did it. She went on it for 6 months, I think, lost 26 pounds or something, and said that she had more energy than she'd ever had before, and that we should all try it. None of my brothers tried it, but I was like, I will try anything. So tried it, and I realized I had an improvement in energy as well. I think looking back, it was getting rid of a lot of sugars, getting rid of just a lot of processed. You take out gluten, you're not going to eat pizza. And then I would kind of just add gluten back after probably 2 years. And it didn't affect me greatly, but I certainly still, you give me a pancake and I'm out for 3 hours afterwards. So that family experience and personal experience, I think is spot on. Okay, back to the 3 stories. What's the second story that helped shape you?
I have to I've had a lot of experience with psychedelics going way back. And rather than picking out one, I would just compress, a number of those experiences. But one thing that I powerfully got from those experiences was the close relationship between what's inside your head and what's outside, and particularly the possibility that you can change external things by changing things internally. One example, which many people can relate to, is how a dog reacts to people who are afraid of them. I have, as you know, I've always had Rhodesian Ridgebacks. And
beautiful dogs that are right around us right now.
Previous male, a big male named Jumbo, all he wanted to do was crawl in your lap and cuddle. I was living out in a ranch way out east of Tucson, and I drove home one day, and there was a worker who was doing some kind of yard work out there, who had a rake, I think, and he was backed up against the wall, and this dog was snarling at him, hair raised, drooling, and he was brandishing the rake. And, there was no way of convincing him that he was producing that behavior in the animal. He thought this was a vicious attack dog that I had trained. I had to take the dog away. But I have seen this again and again, how what's in your head that influences how things react to you.
Oh, I'm sure. And on the last point that you were talking about, the doctors, once they kind of commit to something, there's commitment bias. Once they say this is the right approach to this ailment, then we just psychologically know that now they're going to be more committed to it because they've said out this sounds a lot like confirmation bias, where if you're paranoid of a dog, then you're just going to have this resonance. Then you're going to create the condition in the dog to be scared of you.
Right.
And then, 5 experiences of that in your younger years later, it's going to be.
So I've told these
confirmed.
stories, on other podcasts, but I'll tell them again because they're
Please
very
do.
powerful.
No, I've listened to them, but for our listeners that maybe they haven't.
This was when I was about 28. I had a lifelong allergy to cats. If a cat got near me, my eyes would itch. If a cat licked me, I'd get hives where it licked me. So I always avoided cats. I didn't let them touch me. And one day, when I was 28, I was with a group of friends outdoors, beautiful setting. I took LSD, fantastic. I was in a wonderful state.
What year was this?
This would have been about 1970, I would say, in rural Virginia. So in the midst of this, feeling great, a cat came and jumped in my lap. And I had an immediate, defensive reaction. And then I thought, this is stupid. Why should I react this way? And I relaxed and let the cat play with me and rubbed it, licked me. I had no allergic reaction, and I never have had one since. So instant disappearance of, a lifelong allergy as a result of some mental change. And it seemed to me that it was the being able to drop whatever that defensive attitude was, which was in my body and my mind, that's what had to do with it. So the even more interesting one, shortly after, around the same time, I also I had fair skin and I could never get tan, and used to go to the beaches on the Jersey Shore. I had many second-degree burns, sheets of skin peeling off, and then I'd be back to pale skin again. So I was always told, this is how you are, you can't get tan. So again, one day, around that same time, also on LSD, I think it was by myself then, I was running around naked in my backyard. It was a beautiful space, and I was lying on the grass. The sun was pretty high in the sky, and I had this momentary thought, this is probably not a good idea to do. And then I thought, fuck it, the sun feels
go
good.
into it.
Yeah. And I got tan the next day, and I have ever since. Now, that's a little trickier one to explain than the allergy, but it also must involve the immune system and the mind-immune system connection, because the pigment cells in the skin, melanocytes, are derived from neurons, and there's some close connection there between the nervous system and those cells. But to me, that stuff that's fascinating.
So a skeptical person would say, for the cat one, couldn't you just test that? Give people...
Yeah. You could, if LSD was readily available for that. I would start an allergy clinic.
What does go into you hypothesizing that and then saying, okay, well, now I want to test this?
Well, I'm not a researcher. That's a different mentality. I don't want to do that. I would like to inspire other people to do that. So, I give them the idea. Here, look, I've experienced this. Go see if you can replicate that, and then figure out how to, derive a therapy from that.
For listeners, and I was very unaware of this, what goes into the research? When you say I'm not a researcher, and I think in my head 5 years ago, I would have just been like, but that's easy. Just like set it up at the university and just, check in with people.
It's boring and tedious to me. What I'm good at is coming up with ideas, with hypotheses to test, and give those to other people, let them do the work. I don't want to be in a laboratory doing that. It's not what I'm cut out for.
Well, okay, then what's the
I'm a clinician, not a researcher,
right.
And it's a different mentality.
Yeah. It's not necessarily, it does not seem like it's the same person that comes up with the ideas and then spends the 3 years getting the grants, then the 3 years studying, then the 3 years promoting.
And doctors, think of themselves as scientists. But it just annoys the hell out of me that, that the first step of being a good scientist is to observe. And if you see things that don't fit your preconceptions, you don't throw them out. You try to figure out why that doesn't fit your preconceptions. Maybe your ideas are wrong. And I see that again and again, that people, many doctors dismiss that story that those stories I told you. That's anecdotal, anecdotal evidence, which means that's a wastebasket, labeled anecdotes. You drop it in there.
In the tech world, it's the exact same. It's just like, oh, but that's an anecdote. We need data.
So, most people don't know the literal meaning of the word anecdote. It's from Greek and it means unpublished. So once something is published, it's no longer anecdotal. And I've written about this stuff, so it's not anecdotal anymore.
That's
people
a
should
phenomenal response.
People should be testing it.
That's a great retort. Actually, no, it's published, so it's not. And I've heard you also talk about experiment and experience.
Yes, it's
similarly.
in most languages derived from Latin, and unfortunately not English. It's the same word. In Spanish, experimentar means both to experience and to experiment. That's really interesting. So you can let your experience be a way of experimenting, and you can conduct experiments through your own experience.
Right, which is so it's cast aside so casually of like, yeah, that's a
Right.
And in my world, in the software world, it's like, oh, but that's an N of one, sample size of one. So
Right.
that's not
We
meaningful.
can disregard that.
We can
right.
disregard it.
Right.
But trying to replicate in many really important moments in time, trying to get a sample size of 100 is so cost prohibitive or impossible to replicate that then it's just like, well, just throw it all away. And what I hear what you're saying is observation is a pretty powerful means of accumulating information.
Yeah, that's how you get hypotheses. And then you test the hypotheses. If you disregard the observations, you've cut yourself off from the source of hypotheses.
Okay, so tell me the third story that has helped shape you and who you've become.
The third story. Well, I gave you a story to read about my experiences with death in medical school and growing up.
Got it right here.
Okay.
I had to... The other thing that's really rare about you is putting together disparate, disconnected pieces of information in a very creative lens and medicinal background, an MD, putting together creative, disparate, disconnected things with very little data early on and advocating for it's very rare. But also, you're a phenomenal writer.
Yeah, I'm a good writer.
You wrote for the Harvard Crimson.
Yeah, I developed my skills as a journalist, and and then I also had a lot of experience editing other people's writing. And I get very impatient with bad writing, and a lot of people think that they can't understand things that they read, and it's not that the content is difficult; it's that the writing is bad.
Right. Oh, one of my favorite people in San Francisco, Naval Ravikant says he basically is just like, look, it's the job of the author to grip me. If I put a book down because I don't want to read it after 20 pages, that's on them. That's it's not because
couldn't agree more.
He doesn't have discipline. So yeah, it's right here. I've got it here, and yeah, it's not often that I read through something and then I just had to put it down and think about it for 10, 15 minutes.
Good.
And I'll probably think about it much longer, but I couldn't do anything after reading this. Not only is it well written, but do you mind telling listeners what this
Well, it's called Encounters with Death, and it's about my experiences of death and awareness of death. Going back to a time when I was 3 years old, one of my earliest memories. And as I told this story, I was with my grandmother, my father's mother. My father wasn't home. It was late afternoon, and someone had died. And I think it might have been President Roosevelt, because I was born in 1942, so he died in 1945. At any rate, my grandmother was very upset about that. And I remember going to bed that night and suddenly waking up and realizing I was going to die. And I was terrified and ran down screaming into the kitchen where my mother and father were. I don't remember what my mother did, but my father really was trying to console me about this. And, he told me that I had a soul that would live on after death. And, I was asking
was your father religious?
Not really. And I was asking him, could my soul travel? Could it go to New York City? And as he talked, I suddenly realized he did not believe what he was saying, that this was bullshit. And that was a really disturbing revelation for somebody 3 years old, that, first of all, that these people who I was who were in charge of my life, didn't know, and that I was on my own. And then especially in the face of whatever this very powerful mystery was. So I think ever since then that, I've thought about death all the time, and I found that I could not talk about it with many people. People don't want to talk about it.
Did you feel, and I want to get back to the rest of this, but did you feel, you mentioned the phrase you felt like you were on your own as an only child, from that experience or others?
I think that greatly contributed to my independent mind, my independent thinking, my entrepreneurial self, my being on my own from a very early age.
Were there moments of, duress and stress of feeling
Absolutely.
alone?
I mean, there were many points along the way where I was not very successful, where I didn't have money, where I didn't know what the next move was. So yeah, a lot. But I think I had great trust in my intuition and a sense that, I just had to follow my inner light. To go back to the stuff about death, another experience I recounted in there was that when I was in high school, it must have been about 15, I had an anaphylactic reaction to an allergy desensitization shot for ragweed pollen. I almost died from that. I had walked home from the doctor's office and my throat was itching a lot, and I took an antihistamine, but it got worse. And then suddenly I realized I couldn't swallow and I was having trouble breathing. I was alone, and I tried to call the doctor's office and I couldn't talk. And fortunately, at that moment, my father walked in and, realized I was in trouble, and he hustled me into the car and took me back to the doctor's office, and everybody went into, emergency mode. And I was overwhelmed by this incredible sense of calmness and peacefulness. And I had an out-of-the-body experience where I was on the ceiling looking down at my body and could not...
How old again?
15, I think. Could not understand why all these people were running around crazily and so upset. I was in such a calm, great place, and they shot me up with adrenaline and some steroids.
Real quick, just to go into that a little bit further, you felt like you were it was out of body.
Yeah, I had an experience. I think this was like, the beginning or the early stage of what people describe as a near-death experience. I mean, I didn't see a white light, I didn't see a tunnel, but I was definitely, my consciousness was separated from my body, and the mood accompanying that was incredibly tranquil, peaceful. Everything felt all right, and it just seemed crazy to me that these people were so upset. At any rate, the adrenaline, I could see my heart suddenly starting to beat faster, and I was jerked back into my body, and it was really uncomfortable. I just felt awful. But that stayed with me, and that experience, whatever that is. I mean, it's like, it was really interesting to me.
To anyone, that's had a near-death experience, they often say it's one of the most profound things that they go through. Were you able to talk about this with people a week later, a year later?
No, people didn't want to hear it. And I don't know, it felt like a very private experience, and I really didn't talk much about it.
Would you put that in the top 2 or 3? I know that this is part of just that third story of shaping you of different encounters with death, but would you put that as one of your top experiences?
I think so. I mean, that was very interesting. And I think death is the ultimate mystery. The literal, to me, the literal meaning of mystery is something that you can experience but not understand. There's no way with our thinking mind that we can figure out what that is, and yet we're going to experience it.
To bring it full circle with matcha, that 90% shade cover, and not to be dramatic about it, but that 90% shade cover, I'm sure that contrast, a reduction of the sun and weather, the life force for that plant to 1/10 the amount, and it does produce vastly different results in the tea leaves, because they just go into holy shit mode. Something is totally different. But I wonder if that experience for you also sent you on. I mean, it was only a year later you're wanting to travel. 2 years later that you're wanting to travel the world, rather than go to college with your peers. I had a similar close encounter with death when I was 15 of my sister passing away, and I certainly view my perspective of life of a before and after. There's just like my life split in two. My perspective on things split in two. But it's not something that I've ever really been able to articulate to where someone would understand by the other people that have gone through. I haven't chatted about it with, and I think it is different than someone going through a near-death experience, but it's certainly friends of mine that went through something around that age. I wonder if that also was a factor, that it wasn't at 7 for you, or it wasn't
possible.
At 36.
Yeah. And, also, I think things are changing in our culture, that there's more people willing to talk about death and dying. And, one of the great deficiencies in medicine and medical education was doctors were not given any training in how to deal with dying people. And that often led to, not good experiences at all, that they had to keep people alive at all costs and so forth. I mean, that has changed. And there's now, I think the growth of the hospice movement is one of the best things that's happened in this country. But still, when you compare our relations with death to those of some other cultures, like India, for example, I don't think many people know this, but the reason Orthodox Hindus, it's very incumbent upon them to have sons. And the reason you need a son is that it is the duty of the son when the parent is being cremated, that if the skull does not explode and release the spirit, the son has to smash the skull with a heavy club. I mean, that's a very different relationship with death than what we've got in this culture.
Right.
We want it out of sight and, not discussed.
To that, to the previous topic about doctors believing you can get better when they see that the chances are it's terminal, they're basically, they're ill prepared. I mean, they're not,
right.
Doctors are not trained on death. I mean, it's, as you put in the story, trained on preventing
with it because they're uncomfortable with it themselves.
Yeah. The rest of the story just continues to blow my mind.
Well, the rest of the story was about, how I assisted my father to suicide. He had ALS, which is a devastating disease, and he really wanted out, and he asked me to help him do that. And that was a tough decision, and my mother was totally freaked out, said, we can't do that in this culture, and you'll lose your medical license and so forth. But I really honored his wish. And so that was the first time I'd actually sat with a person and watched the death process. And he was very lucky. He had one of the most peaceful, beautiful deaths that I can imagine.
This was on the heels of him trying to take his own life.
Yeah, which he botched and, wound up in a hospital. And then the hospice people who were in charge of him gave him this lecture about what a bad thing he did. And that really pissed me off. I went and told
for people that don't know, ALS, it's a three-letter acronym, does not do it justice for.
No, it's like in a way, it's the opposite of Alzheimer's disease. The mind is intact and the body deteriorates to the point where you can't move and can't swallow and eventually can't breathe. No cure, and it's progressive, and it's just devastating. But to me, one of the most interesting things was at the his dying process was about 4 hours, and toward the end, his breath became slower and slower and shallower, and eventually stopped. And, I was leaning over him, and after a minute, suddenly he took a breath. And then there was another long period of nothing happening, and he took one more breath. And then suddenly, and it was like instantaneous, he wasn't there. Suddenly this was a corpse. And whoever he was not there anymore.
You could perceive that?
Absolutely. And at the same moment, I felt a wrenching pain in my chest, and I collapsed on him and was crying, and, he was gone. And that was the mystery right there. Amazing. Where did he go? Where did he go? He wasn't in his body anymore.
I've never heard you talk about that. Do you talk about this story?
I haven't. No, when I wrote it up, that's the first time. And I've told friends. And one of the problems in telling friends was then I had a lot of people asking me to help them, promise that I would help them. And I said, I can't do that. That's not my thing. I did this for a parent. And
as a doctor, and as someone that has had these brushes with death, you touched on it, but do you mind building it out more of just our relationship with death, which is in 2019, imagine better than it was in 1992?
Better.
Is that
better? Yeah.
What is our relationship with death right now? If you're just an observer,
well, first of all, there is a trend toward assisted suicide and legalizing that. I mean, I think absolutely people should have the right to end their life. That's not.
And you're going to have listeners. I know. I can just feel it kind of squirming with this concept.
Right. I'm not so sure that doctors should be the ones to do that. That's not the business of doctors. I think there should be a new class of professionals. One term is thanatologist, that's from the Greek word for death. But, somebody who could assist people to suicide if it was decided that was a legitimate thing, and probably not for psychological reasons, for overwhelming illness or whatever.
And why do you say for not for psychological reasons?
Well, I think that's much muddier. If somebody is very depressed and wants to kill themselves, I think, the phrase, this too shall pass, things change. And that just because somebody is very depressed doesn't mean that they're always going to be depressed. And I don't think that they necessarily should act in that state.
Yeah, it feels so. I could sense someone on the other side of hearing this say, well, what about with other diseases? Things can change, or
I don't know the answers to these questions. These are tough questions, and I think that we need people to think about them and think how we come to terms with them. There is there's a new profession that's come into being called death doulas. These are people that are analogous to midwives who assist people through the dying process. And that's a useful thing. As I said, the hospice movement is a useful thing. The fact that, more doctors are, not going to just preserve life at all costs, that's all good. But how we deal with assisted suicide, I don't know. Those are very tough ethical questions. I don't have the answers, but I'd like to see us talking about it.
Well, I think even just having the viewpoint of it could be relevant here and perhaps unproductive here with something like psychological disorders. Yeah, once you have kind of a hammer, then it's like, well, everyone could choose. That seems like pretty dicey territory, especially when it comes to things like depression or mental illness, where maybe there is a better solution. I mean, we already mentioned psychedelics, and that's certainly been, in the last 25 years, perhaps the most exciting new developments.
By the way, in the days when the early psychedelic research was going on in the late 50s and 60s, one of the most promising areas was working with dying people. There was a hospital in Maryland, Spring Grove State Hospital, that did very good research with terminal cancer patients, in which people who were selected for this had sessions with a psychotherapist to prepare them for a guided LSD session, and then did that. And then there were follow-up sessions. Results were amazing that, a very high percentage of these people, first of all, needed much less pain medication afterwards. They were comfortable with the idea of their own death. For the first time, they were able to interact productively with family and friends, because often, in those situations, it's like the elephant in the room. The person's dying, but nobody is willing to talk about it.
Or it's the same with depression.
Right.
My sister, 18 years ago, took her own life after one attempt, and I look back on that, and the dialogue and the openness is changing, which is so great to see.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a very isolated experience she was going through, where I can only imagine she thought about it all day, all the time, but we could not talk about death. And that's, I think that I have certainly seen, in Oregon, there's the Right to Die movement. And it seems, it's almost like we can't even think about that properly, or the positive potential repercussions of thinking about it, talking about it, because it's just this third rail that no one wants to talk about. But even in literally just this conversation, thinking about it, I wonder how beneficial it could be for people with mental illness if they could even just talk about that, explore that option with other people, rather than the idea that they're not exploring it is completely false. They are exploring it, but they're doing it in their own head for 6 straight months.
I think that'd be very helpful. And again, I think the possibility of using psychedelics to assist that process is great.
To assist the process of exploring?
Of exploring and verbalizing and communicating.
Certainly been profound to see the research around terminal illness and people's comfort with death on the other side of psychedelics. That must have been so strange for you. You got to see it on psychedelics. You got to see it kind of in that optimistic heyday. You were mentioning last night the video on YouTube. What's the video that everyone should
Housewife on LSD?
Yeah, from
Just
what
classic.
year?
I think it's from the late 50s. And it was a psychiatrist I knew. He was at UCLA, and he gives this very straight woman a dose of LSD. And, she has a completely non-dual experience. I mean, she is experiencing, you said you're interested in Vedanta. She's experiencing the state that they talk about of non-dualism, and the psychiatrist is such an asshole, and begins asking her questions like, are you comfortable or not? And she just smiles and said, what does that mean?
Right? Yeah, it is such a phenomenal video. I remember,
and she says at one point, I feel really sorry for you that you can't experience what I'm experiencing.
But she says it in the most serene.
Yeah, exactly.
Completely. There is no egoistic kind of angle on it. It's yes, for everyone listening, I don't even. I would encourage you to turn off this podcast, to go watch it because
Housewife on LSD.
And that's before the stigmatization, before the
Right.
major kind of propaganda machine against psychedelics, which is just so, especially in 2019. I think it's why there's such an appreciation for different opinions and different perspectives, because you have this national governmental wide stigmatization of something like LSD, non-toxic.
Right.
I've never taken, but completely non-toxic. And then you have the opioid crisis that we're living in right now. That is, I think I remember reading 200 million prescriptions, not individuals, but prescriptions in 2017. It might've been 2016, but given out in the US for opioids. And yet it's, psilocybin or psychedelic mushrooms, it's still in the broader sense of cultural understanding. It's like, whoa. No.
Dangerous, right?
Dangerous.
Right.
And I've never done mushrooms either, but what has that been like, seeing the really interesting optimism around it in late 50s, 60s, then shut down. What was that like? Did it make no sense to you whatsoever? Or did you kind of also sense, hey, maybe we should put a kibosh on this?
No, I think it's so irrational, that those drugs on a physical level are safer than any drugs we use in medicine. The dangers of them are psychological.
Safer than Advil.
Infinitely. Infinitely. I mean, almost every drug we use in medicine you can kill people with. You can't kill people with psychedelics. However, there are psychological dangers that are real, but those are products of set and setting, of dose, set and setting. It's people's expectations and the environment. And that's why it's really important, if you're going to take those things, to take them in the correct way. And often that means taking them with an experienced person who can help shape the experience in the right way. And that's not going to be a psychiatrist. I think, we need a new class of professionals there as well, who are guides.
Right. I remember asking my psychiatrist friend 4 or 5 years ago, in my ignorance, just saying, so do you do therapy? And she looked at me, she's like, no. And it was that moment that it just completely hit me. Like, I knew psychiatrists and psychologists were quite different.
Yeah.
But it hit me almost the way that, and I can only try to interpret what, because I put it together weeks later. There was almost like, I don't think it was demeaning therapy, but it was just like, no, that's not what we do. But to the average patient, you go to the doctor with an ailment and you want them to look at all available treatments. And in chatting with her since, I know that, it's pharmacology.
Right. That's it. Right.
That's her toolkit.
Yeah.
And it's whatever is, makes it through the trials,
Right.
Whatever gets, sent to the doctors to start.
Our center put on a phenomenal integrative mental health conference in San Francisco this spring for mental health professionals. And it's about a really new model in which pharmacology is a minor part. And the hunger for this is so great among both professionals and patients. And that model that now dominates psychiatry is so obsolete and so limited. It's got to change. But here's, as an example of how things are changing, I have a friend in Vancouver, a middle-aged woman who has wrestled with depression for years and is working with a conventional psychiatrist. And he said to her that he thought she should try to microdose with mushrooms. I mean, I can't believe that. That's great.
A psychiatrist that does practice therapy and is a great therapist in Dallas, Texas, told a really close friend of mine that's had major depression issues for 20 years, has tried every prescription under the sun, as well as CBT and DBT and different things. And the doctor about a year ago just said, I think you should try cannabis.
Amazing. So things are changing.
Right. Yeah. It's, what do you think the source is? So if it's not the content, but the source is, what do you think of that relationship that is changing or has been changing over the last 5-6 years?
Well, I think some of it came from Silicon Valley, where you are. I mean, of successful techies who, say they're microdosing and it's increasing their creativity and productivity. I think that's been one major influence. It's also been research that has been widely publicized about the effectiveness of MDMA for PTSD and psilocybin for OCD and for drug-resistant depression. So I think there's a lot of sources that are contributing to it.
As I add in podcasting and just kind of, it's almost, we went to the medical professions.
As you know, have also been a major influence here.
Right. I want to get you onto your own podcast here in 2019. Just to go back to the story about your father, how have you, just on a personal level, that was 27 years ago. Yeah. It sounds like you've only told a few friends. What has that emotional toll afterwards been like from an individual that has helped assist his own father's death?
I mean, I did the right thing. I had no doubt about that. As I said, my mother was completely freaked out and tried to dissuade me from doing it. It was absolutely certain for me that was the right thing to do. And he couldn't talk anymore at that point, and he was writing on a magic slate. And the night before, he wrote me a message that said, "I can't tell you how proud I am of you for your helping me."
And I want to read a little bit from here, because I think it's just so well captured in the way that you write, and just for people to know. And it's in this short story. Just the buildup of this. This isn't just a Tuesday night. Your father writing this. This is years and years of it, of decline,
right,
and stress on the entirety of your family.
Yeah.
On top of expense. And your mother, she says that in here. She says we can't do that. Our culture doesn't do that. I do want to ask, what are cultures that you've seen? Are there cultures with the healthiest view on this?
Well, there certainly are cultures now, such as, the Netherlands and other countries where assisted suicide has become like totally routine. And even people from this country are going to those places. I'm not sure they've solved all the ethical issues around it, but, at least, they make it available. In British Columbia, that's become also quite routine.
What would the moral argument be for someone that would say, as a traditional Christian, they would say, just murder isn't right?
Well, that's not my business. As I say, these are complicated ethical issues that people have to answer for themselves.
Mm-hmm. So going into the story, the two morticians came and took your father out of the room after he passed. And you're in the room with your mother, your wife, and a nurse, a friend of yours that had also helped. And you write, as soon as he left, I and the three women hugged and laughed. Yes, laughed. Laurie and I described our 6-hour vigil. Before we knew it, the funeral parlor attendants were there for the body, two morbidly obese men who said little and avoided eye contact, took the body out. When you say laughed, what was going through?
I imagine this is relief. It was a sense of relief that it was over, that, this ordeal that my mother had been through was over, that we'd gotten away with it.
I imagine it was, were you really scared leading up to it?
No.
You just knew it was the right thing.
I knew it was the right thing.
And you just, whatever repercussions happened.
Yeah.
And then go back to the story. Jenny, your mother. Jenny blossomed after my father passed, traveling and having adventures that were impossible while she was caring for him. That's, I think, an untold price of us keeping someone that is terminally ill. And I've never really explored this in my mind. So listeners, I'm doing this real time. But that is an untold price of keeping someone alive that is terminally ill for a greatly extended period of time.
Mm-hmm.
The entire family is kind of anchored down.
Yeah.
They moved to Tucson. Your mother, I imagine, just caring for him is anchored down. And you can see that just prolonging an inevitable is not...
well, the thing is, it was more, he got to the point where in another few days, he wouldn't have been able to swallow. And that means they have to put a feeding tube in, but it also meant that he wouldn't be able to swallow pills. And if he couldn't, then I'd have to do a more active intervention, and I didn't want to do that.
Oh, well,
so there was an urgency. It was clearly that was the time that this had to happen.
Well, it's a really powerful story. I hope, is this released anywhere for anyone to read?
Nope. You're welcome to take it with you if you want.
I'll let you save it for your podcast.
Okay,
you can read it to everyone.
Right.
some of the last areas that I want to touch on, then I'll let you get going back to your super productive day. And just to touch on that, you mentioned yesterday about your productivity. Do you mind retelling?
I said, I look to most people out there that I'm extremely productive, but my internal sense is that I'm really lazy and just spend a lot of time goofing off. I don't know. That's just how I feel. I don't feel guilty about that particularly, but I don't feel super productive.
What informs that kind of viewpoint on life of if anything, that one, just kind of relaxing a lot, but also being comfortable with it, because that's very un-American.
Yeah. I don't know. I enjoy relaxing. I enjoy my leisure time.
I remember you telling me this story that was it the dean of the medical school?
It was the dean of students at Harvard Medical School.
Yeah, tell me that
really he was not a nice person, and he delighted in making people feel bad. And the way he made me feel bad was that he would call me into my office every few months and berate me for having too many outside interests. I acted in a theater company. I was writing articles for magazines. And he said I wasn't taking medical school seriously. And he would say I was just a dilettante. And that would make me feel bad. And after several times of hearing that, I went and looked up the word dilettante, and it comes from Italian, and it means to enjoy. So once I knew that, he could never get to me again.
Well, in a puritanical influenced America, enjoyment is not part of the regimen.
Right. And we work harder than any people in the world. We have less leisure time,
right?
Than most other cultures.
Yeah, it is. I when you told me that, I reflected on just how little we are encouraged to relax, and how much when you talk to when I have talked to experts, how much they actually plan relaxing. I know Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, the two best investors in history, plan 4 hours every day of just thinking time. And then you have a cohort of people that idolize them in New York City that are 25, 26 years old, working 90-hour weeks.
Right.
The exact opposite.
Yeah.
Of carving out time in each day to just think.
Yeah.
I want to talk about your books, and I've got two of them right here. But I also want to touch on something that a question that I ask many people was on this podcast is, what's something you think a lot about but you rarely get a chance to talk about? What's a topic that, and this is going to be hard for you because I think you're about to go on Dr. Oz. Like,
right.
You've been on many podcasts. You're encouraged to talk a lot about so many different things, but what is something that would be in that kind of the recess of your mind that are actually the forefront, but you rarely ever talk about?
I guess, one top is magic. I love magic, but I mean real magic. And to me, one of the main components of real magic is how to manifest things. So for me, cooking is magic. That you get an idea in your head of something you want to create, and then you have to manifest it in this laboratory. You have to select the right ingredients, do the right things. People don't think of that, but I think cooking is good training in practical magic. And then you carry that over into other areas of the life. You want something to happen, and what do you do internally, mentally, that increases the chance of that happening?
The hobby of cooking, I think creation in almost all forms pushes you.
Absolutely. I feel that with gardening as well, but I also feel that, like what's happened with integrative medicine, this is now, we're getting a $20 million building at the University of Arizona. The university says this is like the jewel of their thing. A lot of people around the world only know the University of Arizona through this program and me. I mean, all that, amazing that came about, right?
How have you had the persistence or the internal drive to stick with these things that now, yes, 45 plus years into your career, it's so in vogue, but obviously wasn't for so long. It's what I said
earlier, that I have a very strong internal sense of what my path is. And even when I got no or hardly any external, reinforcement of that I just kept putting one foot ahead of the other because I knew that was what I had to do and what was the right thing to do.
Has it ever taken its toll mentally on you? Or
yeah, as I said, there have been times when I really wondered when I was like, it was not clear from one day to the next where I was going to get enough money for rent or what I was going to do. I had dropped out of medicine So yeah, there were a lot of points where I wondered and had doubts and heard criticisms from other people, but I still, deep down, I knew this is the way I have to go.
What about relationally in your life? Did it ever just this, either the entrepreneurial pursuit towards creating things from scratch, or being isolated because of viewpoints that just weren't shared? Were there any relational casualties along the way of friends, of close friends, or colleagues, or mentors, or just family members that you're like, oh shit, this is going to blow up that relationship?
I'm trying to think about that. I mean, there were certainly a lot of people that I was involved with that thought I had made wrong decisions, that I was, doing things that were not going to produce results. I don't know that it took a toll on relationships.
Were there any that you took harder than any others, where you're like, oh, this is, you hear about this with, psychologists and the lineage of psychologists, and then almost to become their own individual entity, they have to point out where their mentors got it wrong, or you see that with kind of the Freudian lineage,
right?
Or in philosophy with the Socratic kind of lineage.
Yeah.
Was there anything like that where you were like, I need to actually part with even the people closest to me? And maybe not, but I wonder if that's ever been the case with some of the really out there things that you push before.
Yeah, absolutely.
People.
I mean, I had several mentors in my life, and some of them got, upset with the directions I was going in. But again, I knew that was the right thing. Also, I think the experience of being an only child, of being very, eccentric, idiosyncratic, has made me isolated in some ways. I really like alone time. I like spending time by myself. I also like, socializing, but it's really important to me to have my private time.
I've never really asked this question, but I'm so interested in that younger Andrew Weil. How would your high school class have described you? And when you're
outwardly,
16?
I was like, very fun, quick-witted, fun to be around. Inwardly, I felt like a man from Mars, that I just did not fit in anywhere.
Do you feel that way today?
Yeah, I guess I still do, but it's like I have all this external reinforcement now.
Right, that is a positive thing. What would you say is the hardest moment in your career when you look back and you just feel like, man, that was the bottom? And maybe it was the times that you're saying that you just didn't know where rent was going to come from.
Yeah, I mean, it was really sketchy, and and in those times,
how old were you?
I would say this was in my, right around the time that I turned 40, and which is classic midlife crisis, and really questioning all the decisions I had made, and when I was in that state, then it was, the criticisms of other people were much more, hurtful, things like my parents saying, you should have been a real doctor. And
what was Andrew Weil doing at 40? Like what?
I was,
you'd already written,
I had written,
books.
Right. But they were never like, the early books were not, major sellers. I mean, I got some money from them, advances, but I was selling articles to magazines and, not really knowing where the next thing would come from. Doing a bit of consulting work, I'd get asked to speak places.
And even people close to you, like your parents, felt like you had gone astray?
Yeah. That was like I had made bad decisions.
Really?
Living out in the desert and this, weird lifestyle. And
in Tucson.
Sure, yeah.
In part of that idiosyncrasy, you mentioned this to me a little bit yesterday, but why Tucson?
My car broke down here 45 years ago.
Okay.
And it took 6 weeks to get fixed. It was an English Land Rover that I'd driven to South America without incident. I one time at the end of the road system in the Amazon, the generator burned out and somebody improvised something to fix it. But when I got it back to this country, I couldn't get parts for it. And I had taken it to the Land Rover agency in Laguna Beach to get overhauled, and drove to Tucson, planning to go down to southern Mexico. I was just going to stay in Tucson for a few days. And the Land Rover agency had forgotten to pack one of the wheels with grease, and a wheel bearing shattered, which is very dramatic. And anyway, it took 6 weeks to get fixed. And it was February of a warm, wet winter. The desert was in full bloom. Fell in love with the natural environment, met people I liked, and never left.
Where were you heading?
I was headed to the state of Oaxaca in southern Mexico to deliver a baby of a friend of mine.
Wow.
And the baby delivered itself, as they usually do. And, I ended up staying in Tucson.
That's phenomenal. Speaking of books, one, I just want to get a sense for what is what is your writing style like? What's your regimen like?
I don't have a regimen. I'm very undisciplined. I write when the mood strikes me. I mean, sometimes I have to meet deadlines and do little shit stuff. But with books, it's often been that I've had a contract to write a book and have been paid money, so there's pressure to do that. And when the pressure gets great enough, I do it. I write in the mornings. If I don't write in the morning, I don't write. I really don't write unless stuff is organized enough in my head to come out.
And you wake up every morning the same time, is that right?
Yeah, I'm pretty. I wake up when it gets light out or earlier.
And with how many hours a day do you spend writing? Because writing Beyond Coffee, it was really
tough.
Yes, it was way tougher than every single time I sat down to write. On the other side, I was like, wow, that wasn't that hard. But in my head, yeah.
I had a book, probably still have it, of writers' quotations. And one that I remember, I don't remember who said this. It says, like, writing is easy. You just sit in front of the typewriter, put the paper in, and wait until drops of blood appear on your forehead.
Right. It is. There's such a mental block around it. And every single time, 3 hours later, I'd be like, whoa, okay, that wasn't bad. That was fun.
Uh-huh.
But then I would sit down the next day and be like, oh, no.
And also, when you're in that state, almost anything else looks more interesting than writing, like watering the plants, checking the refrigerator, doing this with the dogs.
Right.
That's how do you stick and stay at it?
Well, in a previous podcast, I remember you saying the two books, and maybe this falls in line with something you think quite a bit about, because I haven't heard you talk much about them, but the two books that you gift quite often, one is The Way of Life by Lao Tzu, and the other is We.
So both of these, the one common characteristic is that they're very short. And I have little patience for reading, vast amounts of words when the person could have said what they had to say in so little, and Lao Tzu wrote these, 56 verses? I don't remember the exact number.
Yeah, I think it's 80
but that's all he did. It's like this little slim book. And to me, it is so encapsulates, wisdom. You don't need to say anything else. And We is a book by a Jungian psychoanalyst about the psychology of romantic love. And it is also a very short, very, very clear book about the trap of romantic love. And it's so well written and so clear. And both books are about the same size.
Let's, what are some of the traps, just to build on that out a little bit, that at least, intrigued you so much to make that a book that you wanted to recommend it?
Well, I just see that. I mean, our culture is totally obsessed with romantic love. I mean, you listen to popular music, that's, all it's about. It's about the joy of finding it and the pain of losing it.
Right.
And, his analysis of it is that it's all projection. There's something, you are projecting something in yourself onto the other person, and falling in love with that. And if, with continual exposure, that fades and the other person is left looking like on their own. And then if you can't find some way of translating that falling in love experience into some other kind of state, you're doomed.
I remember learning years ago that to the Greeks, the highest form of love was friendship. Right. And I don't know if We covers this, but in the lecture that I was hearing about this, that it's a much more recent phenomenon for romantic love.
That's correct. That came Victorian about in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, Middle Ages maybe. Yeah. And for the Greeks, you loved your wife, but it was the friendship with your wife that you had, and your friendship outside of your marriage. And the same with your wife, her friendship with friends was the highest form of love. And it's always stuck with me, because when I do think about it for my wife and I, it is absolutely 1000% our friendship.
That's great.
That is our favorite facet.
Well, I recommend those two books, and I quote from them a lot, and I think they're terrific. And Lao Tzu, by the way, there are many, many translations, and some of them are totally opaque. That and then you read one that's this one that I particularly like is translated by a man named Witter Binner, and it's so clear. It really speaks to me, and I think he really captured the essence of what Lao Tzu was saying.
Do you practice any tradition or religion?
No, I am. I'm very attracted to Buddhism, but Buddhism as a psychology, not as a religion. The religion of Buddhism leaves me as cold as any other religion. It's ritual, it's superstition, but the psychology of Buddhism is brilliant. It's like, I think it's just amazing analysis of the human condition and practical ways of reducing, suffering.
Right. Yeah. My favorite aspect of Eastern philosophy that runs through Vedanta, Buddhism, Hinduism, non-attachment.
Right.
And, we were talking earlier about that conscious state of, or that your gardener, the inability for the gardener to think that he was evoking the state from the dog.
Right.
And what's happening in our mind, having a relationship with what's happening outside. And I think for entrepreneurship, for creators of all kinds, there's almost nothing as destructive as being so attached to a certain outcome, and that internal attachment, stress, anxiety, forcing, it can be the limiting factor for some beautiful creation. 20 degrees to the right, not being able to come to fruition. If you were to give listeners, out of your 15 books, which one was your favorite one to write, and which one is your favorite one to go back to over and over again?
That's tough. I mean, The Natural Mind, my first one, I think is really, really good, and it holds up after all this time. It's still used in college courses.
I feel like it's more applicable now than
I think it's more
30 years ago.
Now. And I'll tell you a funny story. I mean, it got me in a lot of trouble when it came out because it was, Life magazine reviewed it, said this was a dangerous revolutionary book. Vice President Agnew attacked me in a campaign speech, saying that this was, subversive and dangerous.
And I think some people even used your own research
yes.
To discredit the book. I was saying,
but I'll tell you one funny story that I love. This was probably somewhere in the, I don't know, maybe late 1990s. I was in New York City. It was summer. It was a warm summer evening. I was walking along Park Avenue, and a very disheveled homeless man, looked like he was in his late 30s, came up to me to panhandle me. And I was brushing him off, and he looked at me and said, "Are you Andrew Weil?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Wow, I read The Natural Mind when I was in college, and that's one of the most influential books I've ever read."
Who knows? Maybe he was an ascetic, maybe it's an extreme form of non-attachment.
Maybe.
Well, and I think it's just worth going into a little bit here on the book of why I would surmise that people. I mean, it's dangerous in that it's kind of just, it's not condemning or condoning.
Exactly, but also a lot of this was about that the experiences that you get when you take drugs are really within you. It's not, the drug may release something, but it's not in the drug. And if you try to recreate the experience by taking the drug frequently, you lose it. And you have to find some other method like meditation to maintain it. I mean, that was one of the main arguments in that book.
Yeah.
Another book that if you haven't read, I have one called Spontaneous Happiness, which is about emotional well-being.
Right. And I breezed through that one in research for this.
Information in it. And the other one, the first book that became, was a #1 New York Times bestseller was Spontaneous Healing. And that's really the philosophy of integrative medicine, about that same thing, the idea that healing is within you. It doesn't come from without. It's the same.
And I know there are listeners that will kind of think it's woo-woo, and I would have been in that
right.
camp years ago. There's a book that we mentioned right before we hit record, which was Mind Body Prescription, and the author Borno, is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Right.
We're talking about lower back pain and
Sarno.
Sarno,
John
that's right.
Sarno. Right.
John Sarno, and a friend of mine in Silicon Valley who's a partner at Y Combinator and a former partner at Y Combinator, and just one of the most rational, scientifically kind of left brain individuals, had wrist pain from, he's a programmer, phenomenal. He's probably one of the top 10 programmers that everyone in Y Combinator talks about. I won't mention him here. Well, actually, no, I think it's totally fine. Aaron Eba is his name. And Aaron, if you just Google Aaron Eba Mind Body Prescription, and IBA is his last name. And he has this blog post. In the midst of all these blog posts about programming, he has this one blog post that tells a story about his wrist pain and 2 years of pursuing, 2 years, $20,000, endless visits of pursuing everything to try to get rid of his wrist pain. A year into that, he's given this book, The Mind Body Prescription. I believe that was the name of the version of the book that he got by Sarno, and just discounted it because how can you read a book and get rid of wrist pain? Exactly. It was preposterous to him. Spent another year of pursuing every form of treatment, got 2 different of the best doctors giving completely wildly different surgeries as recommendations, and ultimately was like, all right, before I choose one of these surgeries, I'm going to read this book, because a year later he sees that same friend again, and the friend said, hey, did you read it? I'll read the blog post to get the full download on it, but one weekend later of reading the book, he's never had wrist pain in the last 6-7 years because of reading that book.
Many such stories.
So it's for my lower back pain. I think that's what I should check out. Well, Dr. Weil, thank you so much for the time. It was a blast to get to get your take on so many different subjects. I want to leave everybody with matcha.com. And there's so many different things we could touch on that you're involved with.
Also, drweil.com, which is a website that has tremendous amounts of practical information about health. And
that's right. drweil.com, matcha.com for Matchakari. You've got True Foods, and also hopefully a podcast coming out sometime soon that people can check out. All right, Dr. Weil, thank you so much. Hey, friends and listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to hear more of these types of conversations, go over to your favorite podcast app and hit subscribe, or leave us a review. Good or bad, we love hearing from people that appreciate this type of conversation and want more of it. You can also follow us on Twitter at @GoBelowTheLine, as well as see in our Twitter bio our email address for you to shoot us a note on any suggestions of guests or topics that we should cover. We read every single one, so thank you for those that have already sent those in. That's it for us today. We will see you next time on Below the Line.
Below the Line is brought to you by Straight Up Podcasts.